Okay, so today's is just a discussion session. I'm not going to be talking about any new data. I'm just going to be discussing this book, The Genetic Lottery, Why DNA Matters for Social Equality, by Kathryn Paige Harden. Kathryn Paige Harden is a professor at the University of Texas at Austin. This is a book that I actually read by the side of the swimming pool during last summer and jotted away in it with a pencil, either agreeing or not agreeing with it. I did find it a fascinating and useful book, and it makes a lot of reference to education, the importance of the role of education in life outcomes, and the role of genetics in influencing educational variation. So I thought this was a good forum to go through the book. Most of what I'll be doing is describing the arguments in the book. I'll do a little bit of evaluation at the end. I'll be doing some context setting at the beginning, and also talking about some of the key ideas in there. So I don't know who's out there in Zoom land. If you're a behavior genetics expert, my apologies. If you're a teacher, you're probably asking yourself, can I carry on doing teaching, ignoring all this genetic stuff? And I'm going to say, yeah, probably. But you may be interested in this because maybe down the line at some point, some of this genetic information and these techniques are going to become useful. I think when we get to the end, you'll see that genetics may not become useful in the way that we're all expecting. It may be in a more kind of indirect way, in that it feeds into better social sciences research in general. Okay, so my attempts to get over the contents of the book, I'm probably going to have 3 goes at this, and maybe they'll get better as we go. But first, I'm just going to jump in without any context at all and tell you in 2 slides what the main arguments of the book are. So the main arguments that Kathryn Paige Harden makes are that education plays a key role in life outcomes. Life outcomes like economic success and health, for example, and whether you manage to avoid going to jail, and that children's life chances depend on how well they fare in 2 of life's lotteries. These lotteries are a metaphor for chance events over which these children have no control. Children come into the world, into a certain family. They have no control over the family they end up in, whether that family is rich or poor. And children have no control over the genetic makeup they inherit. So if you're into theories of justice, any theory of justice should seek fair outcomes and not penalize individuals for differences over which they have no control, shouldn't discriminate. And if you are interested in addressing social inequality, you must take seriously one of its causes, which is variation in genetics. Therefore, genetic inequality, like social inequality, should be addressed by preferential allocation of society's resources to those more unlucky in the lottery. And separately, so that would be your kind of policy advice, and separately, genetic data allows social science researchers to have better causal theories about environmental influences, so that our somewhat precious resources in designing interventions and targeting interventions are most likely to have an effect. So that's like the potted version of the argument of the book. So it's a very quick version. Now I'm going to do it all again in a little more leisurely fashion. I'm going to start by talking about, why did I take this book as my holiday reading? I could have had like some kind of airport thriller or something. Why was I reading this by the side of the swimming pool? And then I'm going to give some context, some of it social, some of it political, some of it scientific, to fit this book into. And then if you have no idea about genetic methods and behavioral genetics, I'll try and explain two key concepts which come up in the book. One of them is jwaz, and the other one is pigs. It's a tough, like, you cannot get into this field unless you can memorize these abbreviations. So I won't even tell you what they are. It's an abbreviation thing, right? There's another one, SNPs, that you have to know as well. There you go, things you have to learn. Then I'll have another go at what the book covers, and I'll do that by picking out some choice quotes. And then if there's still time, I'll zip through the chapter contents so you can see how Paige Harden goes about building her argument. And then I'll finish off with a little bit of opining, an appraisal of, for me anyway, what I thought the strengths and weaknesses of the book were. Okay, so why is this book of interest? Well, this is a seminar series of the Center for Educational Neuroscience. We're interested in what the insights into brain mechanisms of learning can contribute to improving educational outcomes. So it's really like the brain and how that relates to cognitive abilities. So why genetics? Isn't that a little bit too low level? Well, I'm interested in genetics enough that I teach a course on genetics, even though I'm not a behavioral genetics, but Lucy is nodding because she's sat through the whole thing last year. So this is just kind of more of the same for her. So I teach a course, but there's some basic facts that half of the variation in educational outcomes can be predicted by genetic variation. So, you may want to do something with that fact. Exactly what? I think we're still trying to work out what you do with that fact. Genetics, very interesting because for me, I would theoretically call myself a neuroconstructivist. So neuroconstructivism is the idea that you take a theory of cognitive development. For educators, it's a Piagetian theory that argues that cognitive development is about building more complex mental representations out of simpler ones through experience with the world. And you unify that theory of cognitive development by an understanding about how brain function develops. And you try and have kind of consistency with understanding how brains develop and how minds develop. So the story is one about trying to get the different disciplines, the different levels of description to be consistent with each other. And because all of cognition involves the brain, and the brain is ultimately biology relies on gene expression. So even though your goals may be high-level ones about understanding how learning works in the classroom, you have this kind of hierarchy of disciplines, and at some point we should be understanding why genetic variation has this big impact on educational outcomes. Now, I'm aware that the field of genetics is, it's very fast developing at the moment. So a number of the papers that I will flash up today were only published last year, for example. But it's still going through some growing pains. For me, it feels a little bit like brain imaging was in the 1990s, where a lot of it was just being impressed at what it was we could measure with the technique. Rather than doing sort of tough hypothesis testing, it was more about, wow, we can see brains lighting up. And there was a lot of research in the 1990s in brain imaging about honing and improving the methods and being more rigorous about the approaches. And even today, we don't think brain imaging, functional brain imaging, is going to tell us exactly what's going on. It's only one convergent strand of evidence that we put together with various other methods to understand how things work in the brain. So I view genetics as the same. It's going through this kind of growth period, and it's only ever going to give convergent evidence that we need to fit together with lots of other sources of evidence and approaches. Okay, so let's move into context. Let's start with the behavior geneticists themselves. They have begun to share their opinions on education. So G is for Genes was a book published by Kathryn Asbury and Robert Plomin in 2013, 2014. And Robert Plomin subsequently had a book out called Blueprint, How DNA Makes Us Who We Are. And this is trying to bring together all the behavior genetics evidence about how genetic variation is associated with various kind of behaviors throughout development and life outcomes. And both these authors have begun to express views on the implication of their work for education. So their book was subtitled The Impact of Genetics on Education and Achievement. So just to pull out a couple of quotes, Robert Plomin says, I think a genetic view suggests an active model of education where children create and modify and select environments that are correlated with their genetic propensities. So this is kind of moving in a direction that the education system should be structured to support that, to allow children to specialize in areas that would support their strengths. And then in his Blueprint book, he says, what would you do if you heard about a new fortune-telling device which predicted school achievement from the moment of your birth and was completely reliable and unbiased? And in his book, he says, effectively, this is the kind of tool you want to use for personalization of education. Use that information to decide how the child should be best educated. Now, Kathryn Asbury is kind of sensitive. She wrote this as a quote from a newspaper article. She's sensitive to the reluctance sometimes of educators to talk about genetics. And she says, as difficult as it is, it's important we discuss the part played by genes in cognitive ability. We have created a situation in which higher education is seen as the only respectable destination for young people, even if they become below average students at below average institutions with below average graduate employment prospects. So already we can see these researchers going from sort of philosophically, what is the data, to making suggestions about what should be, so recommendations about how education systems should be run. And for Kathryn Asbury, it's using information about genetics to encourage certain people to pursue certain kinds of pathways through education. Okay, so that's the behavioral geneticists. What comes out of that message is the importance of using prediction from genetic information rather than using genetic information to understand mechanism as explanation, to understand what's going on. So this was a paper published in 2021 of Robert Plomin explicitly arguing that genetic information should be used for prediction rather than explanation. We'll come back to what polygenic scores are in a moment. This idea of prediction is motivating something called precision education. It's an idea that comes from medicine about trying to use big data to unify all the information you have about a person, including genetic and behavioral and hormonal and lifestyle, all the information you can to get a better profile of individuals to target medical intervention. And this is an approach then that's being extended into education, to think if we just have more information about our pupils, we could personalize them, personalize the education that they get. And indeed, it's linked to what's called a transdiagnostic revolution of throwing away categories of neurodevelopmental conditions and trying to use other big data approaches to group individuals and in response to the kind of interventions that might best support their outcomes. Again, this is more about prediction. You can see here's the application. This is a 2021 paper. They want to use DNA to predict behavior problems from preschool to adulthood. And it's part maybe in this policy view about how science can feed into policy. This is a 2016 paper. Forecasting from childhood, the fact that a small segment of the population has a very large economic burden on the health system, on the criminal justice system, on the welfare system, and so forth. And for policymakers, potentially there may be big wins if it's a minority of the population producing a majority of the social costs, and you can then predict who that minority are at an early age. Potentially you can target resources and support an intervention to alleviate negative outcomes. So it's all part of a prediction view to inform policy and to enable interventions. So I'll put up here just a selection of papers showing the different kinds of areas that behavioral genetics is getting involved in, and I pulled out some of the quotes from these if you're quick at reading. But you can see that behavioral geneticists are getting involved in things like social mobility and things like the correlation between educational achievement and socioeconomic status. And where does that correlation come from? Is it genetically mediated? And arguing that can use genetic data to see the effect of selective versus non-selective schools. So these are all kind of social educational issues that genetic data is now being applied to. That's kind of science, but you're also getting commentators appealing to this kind of research. So this is an example of a blog from Toby Young. Toby Young's this is a quote from the this is what the Sun newspaper thinks Toby Young is. Toby Young is an outspoken journalist and columnist who has become one of the most vocal advocates of the free schools movement. So he's very sort of right-wing, free speech advocate, but involved in educational circles. And he published a blog after having got together a group of free schools and run them for a while to try and improve educational outcomes. He discovered it wasn't that easy. And he published this blog saying, well, maybe this is because the differences in IQ are largely genetic. So therefore, it's not easy to raise educational outcomes if there is this kind of genetic influence. That caused a big storm at the time, and Toby Young was just at that point getting into sort of government committee roles and was forced to resign because he was accused of advocating eugenics, I think, or something like that. So these are stormy waters potentially, and this is a recent article in a journal, which is an opinion piece, saying that we have to be really careful about how genetics research is presented, and that it can be weaponized by extremists. And they say in this article, geneticists must rethink how they conduct their research and how they communicate their results. All scientists should be asked to consider potential harmful impacts of their work. So we go from basic science into trying the scientists trying to think about what are the implications for social and educational issues, and then concerns about misuse of these data and how they can key into some very polarized views that are out there in society. Indeed, Paige Harden's book elicited a very strong reaction when it was published. A lot of this discussion took place in the New York Review of Books. Initially, Paige Harden had an article summarizing the arguments of her book. And then there was a book review that decried her as a biological determinist and a reductionist, and basically used some strong language to reject the book. out of hand. There were a follow-up. You can see there's a review of the review on the right-hand side here, saying what a bad review that was. So that's a review of the review and saying it was a bad review. And there's Paige Harden saying these guys, the reviewers were actually it's an educator and a historian from Stanford University, so they were academics, but saying she didn't feel that they reviewed her book, that they reviewed arguments that they didn't like and rejected them. And the review of the review basically pointed out that the reviewers didn't really reject any of the scientific evidence. They just didn't like the interpretation. So that's a set of sort of background of other research that's going on and how it keys into social issues. I'm going to move on to try and explain a couple of key concepts that are going to be relevant for understanding the arguments in the book. One of those is the genome-wide association study, the GWAS, and the other is the polygenic score. So we can start with a more old-fashioned approach to understanding genetic influences on outcomes, and that is the twin study. So what you do is you take a set of twins and you look about, let's say, how well they did in their GCSEs. And we know with twins, we have identical twins who share the same DNA, and they're typically raised in the same household. And we have non-identical twins who, on average, only share 50% of their DNA. They're also raised in the same household. So what we can do is have a look at the similarity of the twin pairs. And if we see that the identical twins seem to be scoring more similarly than the non-identical twins, when things like family background seem to have been controlled for, because all these kids were being raised in the same household, then maybe we can infer that the greater similarity of the identical twins in how well they're doing at their GCSEs is due to their greater genetic similarity. So this is the basic method to try and infer what is the genetic influence on outcome by manipulating genetic relatedness in twin designs. So if you do that, you get a graph a bit like the one I'm showing you here. So it goes from 0 to 1. That's all of the variation in GCSE results. And then you can split it up into how much of that variation appears to be coming from genetic variation using this twin study method. So that's the red bit. And you can see on GCSE results, that's about 60%. And then the blue bit is environment. You can split that into environment that makes individuals similar or makes them different. Doesn't really matter for our argument. We're just going to focus on the red bit, right? It's about 60% of the variation in GCSE results seems like it's coming or is predicted by genetic variation. Now, we know from decades of educational research that there are a whole bunch of other predictors of how well you're going to do in GCSEs, including things like intelligence, but also non-cognitive attributes like self-efficacy and your personality and so forth. So these researchers also had a look at the heritability of other things that predict school achievement. And they found that those had quite high heritability as well. So they concluded, what do they say, the high heritability of achievement may also be due to many traits such as personality, motivation, and psychopathology. So that's your basic estimate that quite a lot of the variation in educational outcomes seems to be predicted by genetic variation. But we're just doing that, we're inferring that by looking at twin studies. So the next step was to go down into the DNA and actually measure variation in DNA and see if we could predict that variation in educational outcome by directly measuring DNA. So this involves something called the genome-wide association study. We know that the genome has about 4 billion genetic letters in it. So those letters are G's and C's and T's and A's. That's your alphabet. But we know that 99.9% of the genome doesn't vary across humans. That's because we want to be biological life, and we want to be vertebrates, and we want to be mammals, and we want to be Homo sapiens, and we can't do that without having a certain genetic makeup. But some of the letters do vary. So 0.01% of the letters of the DNA vary. And what we can do is we can split our sample. Let's say this is actually drawn from a genome-wide association study of whether adults had schizophrenia or not. So if you had schizophrenia, you'd be called a case. And if you didn't have schizophrenia, you would be called a control. So we've got two groups of individuals. And for all the letters that vary across the whole genome, you can have a look about, does it matter individually, looking at each letter, what letter you have there for whether you have schizophrenia or not in this case. So if it does matter, you'd expect there to be a different frequency of a certain letter in a certain position in the cases than in the controls. So you do a little statistical comparison for each of those DNA letters. And then you do that for every single DNA letter that varies. And the biggest studies today would measure about 10 million DNA letters that vary. And what you've got down at the bottom is called a Manhattan plot. That is plotting all the DNA letters grouped by which chromosome they're on, from 1 to 22, and showing how big an effect you get depending on which letter you have at that position. And there are some dotted lines going across saying that you have to be above the dotted line for that to be statistically reliable. Okay, so this is called the genome-wide association study, measuring variation in DNA letters, seeing if that predicts for us, like education and achievement. What these studies tend to have shown is that you need really big samples to get any results whatsoever. And if you do that, you find the individual DNA letters, they are called otherwise single nucleotide polymorphisms, SNPs, but don't worry about that. That each of them only has a tiny, tiny contribution to the outcome. And what that tells us is, first of all, we're going to need very big samples to detect these genetic effects. And secondly, where we have variations in things like educational achievement, or indeed things like how tall you are, it is the result of variation in many, many genes, maybe thousands of genes. It's not like one gene, two genes, like thousands of genes that vary. Okay, so that's a genome-wide association study. And a polygenic score, I couldn't remember how to explain this clearly, so I just went to the King's College website. King's College is one of the centers in the UK of behavior genetics, Robert Plomin's lab, and they have a nice blog there. So I can read this out. This is nice and clear. A decade of genome-wide association studies indicates that the combination of multiple genetic variants, that's the single base changes, the A, T, C's, or G's, can influence complex polygenic traits like education and height, each with tiny additive effects. A polygenic score is a way of summarizing these multiple genetic effects into a single score. Usually this is simply just the sum of the trait-associated genetic variants that an individual carries, weighted by the estimated effect size of the variant taken from the GWAS. The total score can be used to summarize an individual's common genetic predisposition for a specific trait. Okay, so you can use a GWAS to come up with some kind of recipe that you can plug anyone's DNA into, and depending on their DNA, it will spit out a single number, which will be a prediction of how tall you're going to be or how well you're going to do in education. Okay, so I will now show you the most recent attempt to do this in education. And it is using DNA variation to predict something called educational attainment. So this isn't how well you did in your GCSEs. This is how many years did you spend in the education system? Okay, it's not a great measure, but it's the sort of measure that these guys have available to them when they're trying to collect data on 3 million individuals. It's a very big sample size. And when they did that, they found that of these DNA letters, about 4,000 of them showed statistically reliable effects in predicting outcome. Now, I put a little bit of table 1 there for you. And you'll see in table 1 in the left-hand column, it's got EA1 up to EA4. So this is how many times these guys have tried to run this educational achievement analysis, going from DNA variation to how many years you spend in school. And you can see the N in the second column is how big the sample size was. So it started off with 250,000. 250,000, no less than that, 1/8 of a million individuals, pretty big samples for a psychologist, and they only found 4 DNA letters that correlated with educational achievement. So I was a bit sad on that. But they came back shortly afterwards and they bumped it up to 300,000, and then they found 74 DNA letters. And then they came back. So how many are they looking at? They're looking at about 10 million possibles, right? Then that 400,000, they were up to 162. Over a million, they found 1,200 DNA letters. And now with their gleaming 3 million sample published last year, they can find 4,000 DNA letters, which show statistically reliable prediction in how many years you're going to go to school. So there is the Manhattan plot. And if you're a behavior genetics person, you are delighted with how many of those blue dots are above the black dotted line. That's like a big result, you know, genetic influence on educational attainment. Super. What you're looking at down the bottom here is, so there's like a bar chart with rising bars. And that's your polygenic score. You use the recipe from the plot at the top to generate a single score for each individual. And if you take the bottom 10% of people, the 10% of people with the lowest score, you can see, so this is bottom right, how many of those completed college. And you can see if you're in the bottom 10%, only, where are we, about 5% of those individuals finished college. Whereas if you're in the top 10% of polygenic scores, you're up to about 60% of those individuals. There's a blue and a green bar there. It's just 2 different samples, nothing to worry about there. And then you can see in the bottom left, this is the polygenic score. How much of the variation in outcome could these polygenic scores predict? How accurate were they? How good a predictor were they, and how well you were going to do in school? And you can see the 2013 study that only had 125,000 individuals. They could only explain 3% of the variance. But now with our biggest sample, we're explaining maybe 16% of variance in outcome. And it depends who you talk to about how good that is. So that's what 16% of the variance looks like. The polygenic score is along the bottom, and the years of education is on the y-axis. I guess if you look right in the middle there, so 0, your polygenic source. So I'm looking at the kind of green here. I can see that people scoring right average on the polygenic score had years of education varying from 6 to 22. So although that's a nice regression slope, you would say at any level of polygenic score, there's a huge amount of variation. And Kathryn Paige Harden would look at this, and you can find in her book that she says she just doesn't think these polygenic scores are powerful enough to be useful at the individual level. That's her view. Plomin and his colleagues would differ. They think you can use polygenic scores. Paige Harden says they're not strongly predictive enough at the moment. Okay, worth commenting that, you know, there some people criticize these approaches even now. This was a paper out last year. I think at some point in Paige Harden's book, she says, we're in the golden age of behavior genetics. And Evan Charney says, the golden age, scare quotes, of behavior genetics. And he has a bunch of criticisms about the statistics used and failures to replicate and failures to generalize. So this is one table he has where he says, if you look at those individual letters of DNA variation that have come up in these GWAS studies, say for intelligence and educational attainment, how many of them replicate across multiple studies? So he has like one study found 5,000 of these SNPs. Of those, 320 replicated in 2 studies, 43 replicated in 3 studies, 11 of those replicated in 4. Across 6 studies, only one of those 5,000 replicated. So, you know, there are concerns out there. I think I'm not too bothered about these criticisms. I think this is probably sort of healthy scientific self-correction, being kind of self-critical rather than undermining the field per se. But it's worth knowing that there are those kind of criticisms out there. There is something to be concerned about, though, and this paper illustrates it. Again, this paper was out last year. So they took some polygenic scores. One of them was for education, but for some other things like, where are we? Complex traits, some health traits like body mass index, sedentary behavior, substance use, things like that, range of behaviors, took the polygenic scores for those, but then tried to see, these were derived from UK samples. Could you predict the polygenic score level depending on where people came from in the country? Now, if the polygenic score is telling you about the genes causing the outcome, it shouldn't matter where in the country you come from. And it did. Now, we know that the background genetic information varies depending on where you are in the UK. So there's a little map of that down in the bottom right-hand corner. That's because people haven't moved around that much, and there's just kind of genetic marker variation. It's not doing anything, just tells you a little bit where you come from, you know, your ancestry. The fact that geographical location is predicting polygenic scores tells you that actually the polygenic scores are probably picking up differences in socioeconomic status that are correlated with the genetic differences. So some of the polygenic score is not about cause, it's not about biology, it's about socioeconomic status. And indeed, the huge study I just showed you, this bit's a little bit technical, but broadly, these guys in the 3 million sample, they tried to distinguish their polygenic score into a direct genetic effect, which is the causal effect of the individual's genes on a phenotype. So what they think is really genes in you that are causing your outcome, and to distinguish that from a population effect. Now, the population effect includes the genetic effect, but also other indirect effects that come from relatives, such as how your family raised you and your socioeconomic status and a whole bunch of stuff about your environment that just happens to be correlated to the genetic variation. So you can control for all of that background by controlling an individual's polygenic score by dividing by the parent's polygenic score, which kind of sucks out a kind of correlated influence. Bit technical, but if you have a look at height there, you can see that 1 is like the whole effect. Does it come down when you control for indirect effects? And for height, no, it doesn't really, and it doesn't really for body mass index, suggesting that the polygenic scores are really picking up the causal effect of the genes. But if you look for educational attainment, it drops almost by 50% when you go from the direct genetic effect to the population effect, suggesting that a polygenic score of education is very nice, but it's not all genetics. A lot of it is correlated environmental effects. Okay, so there are some things to be worried about, but you know, and I'm sure methods can be improved and so forth. I'm going to skip over that one as well. All right, let's for the next 10 minutes, just solidly spend some time on the book itself rather than the kind of science behind it. So I'll pull out some key quotes from the book. In the US today, whether one is a member of the haves or has-nots is increasingly a matter of whether or not one has a college degree. If we can understand why some people go further in school than others do, it will illuminate our understanding of multiple inequalities in people's lives. But there's another accident of birth that is also correlated with inequalities in adult outcomes. Not the social conditions into which you were born, but the genes with which you are born. And there's a very nice graph, which I've very poorly reproduced from the book, that is having a look at what is the rate of college completion depending on the lowest quartile versus the highest quartile of family income. So that's showing a big difference of socioeconomic status on your educational outcome. But on the other side of the graph, you're seeing the same distinction, but now by the polygenic index, your polygenic score that came out of the GWAS. And it's showing a pretty similar effect size in predicting college completion as socioeconomic status. So Paige Harden is just saying, hey, look, SES and genetic variation are both big contributions to inequalities in educational outcomes. Next quote, in A Theory of Justice, egalitarian political philosopher John Rawls used a metaphor of the natural lottery to describe how people differ in their initial positions in life. A lottery is a perfect metaphor for describing genetic inheritance. Rawls's principles of justice led him to argue that inequalities that stem from the natural lottery were only acceptable if they worked to the benefit of the least advantaged of society. And then we move on to a part of the book which gets a bit dark and talking about eugenics. Paige Harden says, in a footnote published in 1883, Galton introduced a new word, eugenics, to express the science of improving stock, the aim of which was to give more suitable races or strains of blood a better chance of prevailing speedily over the less suitable. Then there's a big section of the book talking about many bad things happening. I'll leave those to your dark imagination, but they include Nazism, racism, and white supremacy. The next quote, I will argue that it is not eugenic to say that people differ genetically. What is eugenic is attaching notions of inherent inferiority and superiority, of a hierarchical ranking of the natural order of humans to human individual differences and to human individual difference and to the inheritance of genetic variants that shape these individual differences. Then moving on a little bit to talking about researchers, the fact that people return time and time again to the scientifically empty question of genetic racial differences reveals how genetic explanations are used to waive people's social responsibility for enacting change. Instead, Paige Harden is going to advocate an anti-eugenic project using genetics. She says that project is to understand the role that genetic luck plays in shaping our brains and bodies, documenting how our current educational systems and labor markets and financial markets reward people with certain types of bodies and brains, but not other types of bodies and brains, and then reimagining how those systems could be transformed to the inclusion of everyone, regardless of the outcome of the genetic lottery. Sorry, this is a bit about researchers. The tacit collusion among many social scientists to ignore genetics is motivated, I believe, by the well-intentioned but ultimately misguided fears. The fear that even considering the possibility of genetic influence implies a biodeterminism or genetic reductionism they would find abhorrent. The fear that genetic data will inexorably be misused to classify people in ways that strip them of rights and opportunities. So I'll give you a quick example of that. I was at a symposium at IMBES, the International Meeting of Mind Brain Education Society. And there was a seminar given by a researcher who worked predominantly on environmental factors in developmental outcomes, including looking at adoption studies and fostering and the effects of these environmental manipulations. But he didn't talk about genetics at all. So at the end, I asked him a question. You described all these environmental factors that potentially have an impact on developmental outcomes, but we know genetic variation predicts a sizable proportion of variation in developmental outcomes. You haven't mentioned genetics at all. Now, I thought I'd be helpful. I'd just offer a multiple choice in my question. I said, is this because you think genetics is 1, irrelevant, 2, impractical, not powerful enough, or 3, distasteful? And the answer of this leading researcher in the field was it's 2 and 3. Per the recent paper by Charney, that was the critical paper I showed you a few slides ago, I would say that current genetic methods are not powerful enough. And I would say genetic research can be, and he paused there for a moment and then pulled out the adjective, mischievous. So that's echoing, that's just showing that there is a reluctance amongst social scientists to think about genetics. Paige Harden says the widespread tendency to ignore the existence of genetic differences between people has hobbled scientific progress in psychology, education, and other branches of the social sciences. As a result, we have been much less successful at understanding human development and at intervening to improve human lives than we could be. And I will give you a very quick example of that in the area of language development and environmental influences on language development. So we do know that children vary a lot in their rate of language development. We also know language skills are important for socialization and educational success. We also know empirically that the amount of language input that children receive in the family home varies hugely between different households, like millions of words. And that broadly correlates with the socioeconomic status of the household. Then we know if you measure the language input to the children, it predicts their subsequent rate of language development. And the researchers working in this field then concluded that differences in language development are environmental in origin. And went the next step to say, well, let's launch a big intervention program that costs like thousands, at least thousands of pounds and lots of researchers' time, to encourage parents to talk more with their children, especially low SES parents. And this is called the 30 Million Word Project, and you can find this website detailing the project based at University of Chicago. So the point here is, you know, that there could be another reason why how much the parents talk is correlated with the children's language development, and that's because there are gene variants that make you better or worse at language and developing language. And it's those genes that are simultaneously causing the parents to talk more in the household and affecting the children's rate of development. And, you know, that's an extreme case, but it could be that the amount the parents talk has very little effect on the variability of the rate of children's language development. We don't know. We don't know because this wasn't a genetically sensitive design, even though it was all biologically related parents and children. So we're running these big interventions when we don't know what the appropriate power of the environmental factor, language input, actually is. So that's kind of an example about why Paige Harden says we need genetics in social in the social sciences so that we can focus on what are the environmental pathways which we can best intervene on. Right, this was the third attempt to go through the book, but I think you've got it by now, right, guys? I think you've got it. Part 1 is about taking genetics seriously. Part 2 is about taking equality seriously. And some distinction, I'll show you a cartoon between equality, helping everyone equally, versus equity, where you help people differentially to try and get a uniform or a fairer outcome. So that kind of summarizes in a cartoon what the second half of the book is about. I'm going to finish up in like 2 minutes, Lisa, just 2 minutes. I won't overrun, I promise. It's heavy duty stuff with all this genetics. Some comments of appraisal. What did I think when I closed the book at the end of my summer holidays and finally dived into the swimming pool? What did I think of the book? So first of all, I'm showing you a diagram of space-time. I hope you like it. This is actually showing two black holes circling each other before crashing into each other and producing gravity waves. But in this analogy, space-time is the USA. And I found the book quite, the whole arguments about what genes do and how they work and how they influence outcomes, it was all kind of contorted around the particular concerns of the USA to do with their history and racism and racial inequalities and discrimination, and then the history of genetics around about eugenics and the bad outcomes. So I found it quite hard to put aside all of these arguments, So they're very specific arguments about racism, that although there are genetic differences between populations, these don't line up at all with what we would call races, and races are social constructs. You can't find a real genetic basis for them. And all of that aside, you shouldn't be discriminating between people based on their genetic differences anyway. So yes, a lot of the book was dealing with that kind of stuff. So if you put that part aside, and it's important to address those arguments, but if you're bothered about, hey, what does this tell me about mechanisms of learning? A little bit distracting. So I thought, on the whole, it was brilliant to see genetics employed within a social justice framework. Quite often, genetic research is sort of commandeered by right-wing commentators. And here, Paige Harden was quite clear that she's a left-wing liberal, and she was trying to argue that for left-wing liberals, genetics is important for those guys too. I would say if you're at all interested in genetics, psychology, and education, this is a fantastic book to read. It's very well written and very accessible. It does end with a very clear message to social science researchers, which I've given you an example of for language development. Use genetically sensitive designs. Even if all what you care about are environmental interventions, using genetically sensitive designs are going to help you focus on that. A little bit less clear when you get to the end of the book about what all of this genetics research means for educators or policymakers. What should they do differently as a consequence? The kind of broad message appeared to be a differential allocation of resources based on genetic differences. And there again, I felt, oh, this is a little bit American, because if you're in a different country, you kind of do some of this already if you have a better social safety net. So we have SEND provision, special educational needs and disability. There is more funding that goes to those pupils. We have kids from poor backgrounds, the pupil premium. There is more funding that goes to those individuals. We have unemployment benefits and disability benefits. So some of that is present in some systems anyway. And then if you push genetics for prediction, you also have to be careful about this whole area of labeling, which educators know quite a lot about. There's labeling theory and risks of self-fulfilling prophecies. And if you're doing screening programs, you have to justify them, you have to know that you can change outcomes, even if you can predict them. So we better have a good pedagogy for individualization or personalization in order to use genetic information. We also need to check that the predictive power of genetics is strong enough. At the moment, 16% of the variants may not be, but how big a sample do we need to get like 50% of the variants? Maybe that's everyone on planet Earth in order, have to join in that GWAS. And there are risks about creating self-fulfilling prophecies with labeling, let alone the ethical implications that this is genetic information from birth, but the babies can't consent, and they don't know what's going to be done with that genetic information in their lifetime. So where are we? Almost on the last slide. The genetic lottery metaphor, it's a powerful one, but it gets you into deep ethical waters. I don't want to go there now because it'll bend my brain. But, if you suggest that you shouldn't discriminate on over factors which people don't have control, that kind of implies you've got a moral responsibility if you can control the genetics of the next generation. And I'm not sure I'm happy about that. I mean, we get into IVF and pre-implantation screening. And then some of the effects of genetics affect people's willingness to take up the resources offered by society. So if you are genetically lazy and however many resources are put at your door, you just say, actually, I just want to sit on my sofa and play video games. Sooner or later, shouldn't you be judged by that, by your actions rather than your genetic potential? These are complicated areas, but I think the lottery metaphor drags you into a debate that we haven't really thought through in detail. The last thing I'd say is that this avoidance of biological explanation, just focusing on, what do the genes do, how do they affect brain mechanisms and brain development, and just going for prediction, I think that's not a good idea in the long run, because if you don't know how the mechanisms work, you don't know the best intervention. And if you don't know the best intervention, that genetic information turns out to be deterministic because you can't affect the outcomes. And of course, educational neuroscience is all about learning mechanisms. So I think I will finish up there. Thanks very much for your attention. And if you've got any questions or comments, I'd be delighted to hear them.
Great, thanks so much, Michael. That's brilliant. There's some comments in the chat just on your presentation, which are nice to read. I did wonder if anyone has any questions, if they want to pop up their hand or pop it in the chat, as Michael said. Otherwise, I can use my chair privileges and ask a question. Yeah, Dr. Julia.
Hi, Michael. Sorry, it's very dark. Lovely and very smudgy, apparently. I don't know what's going on with my camera. Lovely talk, thank you. I was wondering if you had read Angela Sahini's book on the return of race science, and sort of, I mean, I would have a question if you'd read it.
So I've been to various talks in UCL about the new genetics and its relationship to racism. I haven't specifically read that book. So I think Paige Harden does take that stuff head on. She doesn't shy away from it. But I mean, there are two different things going on. One of them is about whether the modern genetics lines up with racism, can be used to support racism, in the way that research will be hijacked by people with particular political beliefs. And the answer to that now is modern genetics does not support racial categories at all. Those are social constructs. So that from a science side, that's one part of it. But the other part of it is the moral side, right? So even though modern genetics doesn't support racial categories, you do find genetic differences between different populations. And you shouldn't run away from the fact that there are going to be differences, right? The point is that just because people are different physically, cognitively, genetically, doesn't mean they're differently valuable, doesn't mean that they shouldn't be treated with the same level of respect and consideration and so forth. So, I know these are sort of murky waters, and indeed, if you read the genetic lottery, Kathryn Paige Harden dives deep into those issues, exactly because racism is such a high-profile issue in the United States.
Yeah, I guess that was where my question was coming from. I was wondering how similar it is to, because the Angela Sahini book basically talks through the history of race science and debunks all of this and talks about, what is it called, the Mankind Quarterly, which is a journal still around, solely dedicated to perpetuating race science. So I guess my wondering was, what does this book add to what's already in the published literature on this issue?
So I think it's the first book I've seen from someone who is interested in the social implications and educational implications of genetics, but is avowedly from a left-wing persuasion. So we're seeing that the genetics in the hands of right-wing commentators, and this book is all about, if you believe that life should be equally fair for everyone and there should be equality and of opportunity, what can genetics do for you? And it's probably the first time I've seen someone spending the time to go into detail about thinking those aspects through. So I mentioned a quote from John Rawls, the philosopher, the ethicist. So, you know, it does dive deep into exactly those issues, whilst trying to reject the eugenics framework and the use of genetics historically or even now to support racism.
Thank you.
That's great. We do have, we are a little over time. I understand if anyone needs to leave, but there's an interesting question by Paul Winter on the chat, which says, having read this book, did it change your view on this topic in any way?
Well, it's got to change it somehow, hasn't it? Otherwise it'd be super closed mind. Yeah, so I guess I knew the kind of arguments about why genetic information could be useful to allow you to focus on environmental causes. And this is like a brand new contribution to the social sciences that for me is the major outcome of the innovations in genetics. So if you're looking for similarities between parents and children, and you're wondering how much of that comes from what the parents are doing, then you can use these polygenic scores just to control for the fact that these individuals are related. And then that allows you to focus on specific aspects of the home environment and parenting behaviors that are actually causal, right? So, I mean, that's a super breakthrough. I guess it was new to me to see the working through the implications of this genetics research within a social justice framework. I was building up, I was getting excited throughout the book about what the take-home message was going to be in the final chapter about what policymakers and educators should do. Because in my view, that involves an understanding of developmental mechanisms and how children interact with the environment and their parents and their peer groups and caregivers, and how they use that to develop cognitive skills and how that influences their emotional development and their reward structure. You know, it's complicated. It's a very long interactive causal chain. So I always thought there's a huge amount of complexity here, and genetics is just a part of that. Your policy implications have got to embrace the complexity of the developmental pathway. So I was super excited about what Kathryn Paige Harden was going to conclude, but when I got to the end, I don't think she had any better answer than differential allocation of resources. So I think that probably reflects the fact that genetics is part of the story, but the causal accounts are very complex and need people to work together at multiple levels of description. So in other words, what the psychologist does looking at sensitive parenting is as important as what the neuroscientist does looking at stress-related systems, as what the geneticists are doing looking at how genes influence, say, I don't know, glucocorticoid receptors in the hippocampus.
Thank you, Michael. Yes, there is another comment. I don't know if you want to comment on that. Otherwise, we can wrap up as it is after 5.
Okay. Gillian says, I think it's interesting that your first few slides mention how the education system could use genetics to support the population to follow an individualized education, picking up on their strengths and interests. However, we are working in a system that pushes higher education and academia on all pupils. Yeah, I know, Gillian, you know, how long is a piece of string? I don't want my higher education system to only be for the 3% of the wealthiest families in the country. You know, that was the higher education system of the 1960s. And I think everyone can agree now, if we try and push it to 50% of our population, that is too high. And somewhere between 3% and 50% is the right proportion. But what is that proportion? I think that's a live debate. But I was uncomfortable with Kathryn Asbury's view that I don't know whether it's, or I feel it's patronizing or something, just to say to certain people, sorry, your polygenic score is too low, you shouldn't go to university. So somehow we have to find a happy medium there. I would say the big challenge is how well we do personalized education. And, you know, I've been looking at that literature. We talk about individualization, responding to children based on, you know, how they're learning in the classroom. We try and tailor our teaching depending on the students' prior knowledge and what we think their ability is. But that's quite rough and ready. It doesn't seem to me that we have the sophistication of different techniques of education that are going to allow us to use the genetic information to do super powerful personalization. But, you know, maybe that will change, and maybe I'm wrong about that as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael. It was a really interesting seminar, and yeah, brilliant summary, and also interesting points for more thoughts. So yeah, thank you everyone for joining. Next week, we'll be joined by Dr. Youre from Leiden University, who's going to be discussing how predictions contribute to learning. So I look forward to seeing you all there. Thank you so much.
Super. Thanks very much, everyone.